So yeah, a few weeks ago, we got an email uh, from Brian Kwoba introducing himself and his new book on Hubert Harrison, and wondering if the Marxist Education Project would be interested in sponsoring a talk. And we immediately, pretty much immediately, I don't know, within a day, certainly responded, yes, that would be great. Because as Steve mentioned already, I think we've been reading and discussing the very period in which Harrison was active. We also have a long the Marxist Education Project had a long relationship with Jeffrey Perry, who wrote the kind of the definitive, and I think Brian will tell us that too, the definitive, comprehensive, overly detailed, perhaps, biography of Harrison, that work that Brian is building on for sure. And we've also, in recent years, gotten to know other people from the circle around Ted Allen, which included Jeffrey Perry, folks like Carl, Peter, David Slavin, Sean Hayhern, and others. So it's very appropriate that we sponsor a talk and have a conversation with Brian. I think I saw that Brian has a little introduction to himself as well in the talk, so I won't duplicate that by reading his biography. So let me just turn it over to Brian.
All right. Thank you so much, Fred. And thanks to the Marxist Education Project. It's great to see that there are folks keeping alive this tradition. And I do want to give a thanks to Jeff Perry, who, without whom my work would not have been possible, without whom I probably never would have even learned about Hubert Harrison, let alone decided to write a PhD dissertation and then this book. So let me also just say at the outset that this is very much an introduction. I'm assuming that most people here have not read the book, so I'll try to give kind of a sense of its main themes and some of what's in there. I do have a book tour that is emerging with new events and things all the time. I will also be at Socialism 2025 this week in Chicago, so for those who are there, maybe we can meet face to face. But yeah, I'll be in the DMV and St. Louis and Atlanta, New York City eventually. So I'll definitely, keep y'all posted about that. Hopefully everyone can see my screen. Yeah.
Yep.
I'll start with a little bit about me. This is baby me. I have a white American mother and a black Kenyan father. Born and raised in the U.S. and educated at I had some really amazing opportunities. I was privileged and blessed to be educated at places that are considered quote unquote high performing schools. But really, I come to this work as an activist, and I've been involved in a number of different activist movements for socialism, anti-imperialism, immigrant workers, LGBT equality, climate justice, Palestine, and so many other things. And all of those perspectives really shape how I approach this work. Funny little story. I never liked history, not in middle school or high school, as an undergrad. I never took a single history course, really. But once I became an activist, that's when I really started to realize how and why history matters, because it explains how we got the society we have, right? And so this is a picture of me, my very first protest back in 2004. This was the first anniversary of George W. Bush and Tony Blair's invasion of Iraq. And I ended up joining the International Socialist Organization. For those who are curious, I was in the organization for about 6 years before I left. We can talk more about that in the discussion, but I just wanted to set that backdrop. So what I'm gonna talk about is Harrison, some of the different dimension of Hubert Harrison's political thought and activity and legacy. And then I'll say a brief bit about his historical erasure. One of the questions you inevitably encounter when you start to study Harrison is, why haven't I heard of this guy sooner? So I'll try to touch on that. So Hubert Henry Harrison was born in 1883 in St. Croix, what is now the part of the U.S. Virgin Islands. And he had some upbringing in the Anglican Church ends up becoming orphaned at 16 and moves to New York the very next year in 1900, thanks to his sister Mary, who had already moved to New York. And like so many other Caribbean migrants, here's the Virgin Islands down here. You can't really see St. Croix, but in any case, he moves to the U.S., ends up in New York, and I just want to give a little bit of the setting of Harlem a century ago. I'm going to play some music and just show some images to kind of set the stage.
Fred, you're still host. One of us needs to enable the audio.
So one of the aspects, there's all this rich cultural and social life happening in Harlem because African Americans from the South and Afro-Caribbeans from the Caribbean are moving to north to places like New York, Chicago, Detroit, and so on. The Great Migration. But this is also the Jim Crow context, right? So lynching is one of the examples of white terrorism that certainly Southern African Americans are fleeing, trying to escape from. Of course, racial segregation, all the Jim Crow laws, the Ku Klux Klan. These are all examples of, things that are driving this migration to places like Harlem, which Harrison, is in the mix of, although coming from the Caribbean. This picture speaks to one of the reasons that Harrison becomes a free thinker, right? This picture of the Christian cross and the Christian aspect of white supremacy that's going on. One of the first ways that he became politically conscious was a sharp break with his Christian training and with religion more generally. He writes this letter, for example, to one of his mentors, Francis Reynolds Keyser, and he says, "I'm an agnostic. I'm not a dogmatic disbeliever, nor a bumptious and narrow infidel. Agnosticism simply means that a man shall not say he knows or believes that which he has no scientific grounds for professing to know or believe." So this idea that he's going to follow reason wherever it leads him and no longer accept the kind of religious dogmas that he was reared on. Here's an example, another great example of his free thinking in terms of as he becomes more outwardly spoken about it. This is the Truth Seeker magazine. You can't see the masthead fully, but it's the Truth Seeker, the main sort of free thinking magazine. And here's an article by Harrison on the menace of exemption, the fact that churches were evading hundreds of millions of dollars in payment of taxes, something that free thinkers were very critical of as they sought to separate church and state. We can talk more about the free thought movement if people want in the conversation, but yeah, they demanded taxation of church properties, getting chaplains out of the military, getting prayers out of school, basically a complete separation of church and state. And Harrison becomes the most prominent Black freethinker, really of his generation, which is unusual given the predominance of the church and Christianity in most Black communities at that time. One of the stories I can also talk more about, perhaps in discussion if people are interested, is the so-called Outdoor University of Harlem. This is an extraordinary social and cultural institution that emerges thanks to people like Harrison, who pioneered the art of street corner speaking in Harlem. And Harrison was a very popular speaker who would often generate audiences large enough to block traffic, as you can almost see from this picture. Now, the other thing about this age that is very similar to ours, in addition to the systemic racism and racial violence, is also the Gilded Age robber barons, right? Which we can think of as the billionaire oligarchs from a century ago. Rockefeller, Carnegie, Morgan. These guys had huge power, not just economically, but of course, their influence on government was extremely intense as well. Here's a picture of J.P. Morgan rowing the ship with Uncle Sam as the passenger. Makes us think of, the extraordinary economic and political clout of the Elon Musks of the world. We could talk about convict leasing. We could talk about the workers that produced the wealth of these robber barons. We could talk about child labor. There's a lot of things that ways in which wealth is being exploited from workers. And this radicalizes folks. So you have the industrial workers of the world, which I'm sure folks here are familiar with. And of course, the Socialist Party is growing massively in the early 20th century. And so Harrison, he ends up joining the Socialist Party, and he writes about socialism and the Negro, as you can see from this excerpt of an International Socialist Review newspaper. And he does a number of things that are new in terms of a black socialist politics, right? So he's one of the first black socialists to articulate a series and an analysis of race and class in US history through what we might think of as a materialist lens, right? A Marxist kind of frame. He organizes the first official black-led party formation, the Colored Socialist Club in Harlem, and this was an effort to reach the black working class with specific types of propaganda and specific arguments, which I'll get into in a second. Basically, trying to address the specific oppression faced by black workers with a specific approach that is tailored to that. So what did Harrison say about this subject, the Negro and socialism? So here's a couple of quotes from his writings. He says, the U.S. government has made a study of the wealth-producing power of the wage slaves and has shown that the average worker produces $2,451 a year, and the average worker gets $437 a year. This means the average employer takes away from the average wage slave $2,014 a year. He's talking about the exploitation of the U.S. working class. He says, under the old system, the capitalist owned the man. Today, he owns the tools with which the man must work. These tools are the factories, the mines, and the machines. The system that owns them owns you and me and all the rest of us, black, white, brown, red, and yellow. We can't live unless we have access to these tools, and our masters, the capitalists, see to it that we are separated from what we make. The chattel slave was compelled to work by physical force. The wage slave is compelled to work by starvation. And he goes on to argue that basically, wage slavery is the new form. And then he says, of course you'll ask, but haven't white working people race prejudice? Sure they have. Do you know why? It pays the capitalists to keep the workers divided. So he creates and keeps alive these racial prejudices. He gets them to believe that their interests are different. Then he uses one half of them to club the other half with. So this idea that you have, the owners, the masters of capital on the top, and you have, working class folks on the bottom pit against each other along racial lines, among other things. And as Harrison explains, he says, whenever large groups of men find profit in injustice to other men, they will evolve a system of ethics to reconcile their minds to that injustice. They cannot continue to do wrong without calling that wrong right. That is why the capitalist class cannot even think justice so far as the workers are concerned. And that is why men who think that they can see a social or economic advantage for themselves in the degradation of the Negro will continue to think that degradation right. So basically this idea that, racism is serving the capitalist class, right? Dividing workers and keeping them fighting each other. So, what did the socialists demand? Harrison campaigned for Eugene Debs for president. Debs was the perennial socialist candidate for president. Debs made clear what he believed the Socialist Party stood for. He says, "We demand the machinery of production in the name of the workers and the control of the society in the name of the people. We demand the abolition of capitalism and wage slavery and the surrender of the capitalist class. We demand the complete enfranchisement of women, the equal rights of all people, regardless of race, color, creed, or nationality. We demand the earth for all the people." And one of the things I noticed about Harrison's politics as a socialist is this argument that, if you vote for the Socialist Party or if you vote for Debs, then you're a spoiler, right? This is something that they heard, just like we hear much today. If you vote outside the two-party system, you're said to be spoiling the two-party system. Harrison said, "The talk of throwing away your vote is sheer humbug. For even if it came to the worst, it's better to vote for what you want and not get it than to vote for what you don't want and get it." This was a common socialist argument at that time, right? The idea that you should vote for Eugene Debs and not get him rather than vote for one of the two capitalist parties and get that. Harrison was active in the Patterson Silk Strike, so not just making a theoretical contribution or even a party contribution, but a contribution directly to the working class and labor movement. Patterson, New Jersey, 20,000 workers from the silk mills go on strike in 1913. Harrison, as you can see from this picture, is one of, if not the only, black speakers at the rallies of these strikers. And these are some of the leaders of the IWW as well. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn is here seated in the middle next to Harrison. Big Bill Haywood, another big IWW and Socialist Party leader at that time. So this shows something of Harrison's stature, that he was, speaking with leaders of this caliber. Now, if I can shift gears, in 1917, the U.S. goes into World War I, supposedly to make the world safe for democracy. That's the official reason. I'm sure many of us are familiar with, the causes and sort of dynamics of that, so I'm not going to go into it too much. But Harrison responds by founding the Liberty League of Negro Americans, which, as you can see from this poster, was designed to stop lynching and disfranchisement and make the South safe for democracy. And it was basically a mass meeting that emerges and becomes an organization in Harlem. Here's the membership card. You can see Africa First on that, which I'll come back to in a second. This is the time of massive state repression, right? Because millions of people opposed U.S. entering the war, the industrial workers of the world, socialists, some anti-war socialists, and especially after the Russian Revolution and the Seattle General Strike, there's a need by the U.S. government to crack down on opposition. They passed the Espionage and Sedition Acts, which essentially criminalize anti-government speech. And they end up raiding the IWW offices all across the country, deporting people like Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman and many other foreign-born radicals. It was a massive period of repression, the first Red Scare after World War I, during and after World War I. And some African Americans capitulated to this extreme wartime fervor. Du Bois is a important and unfortunate but very instructive example. Du Bois writes this famous editorial in 1918 where he says, "Let us, while this war lasts, forget our special grievances and close our ranks shoulder to shoulder with our own white fellow citizens and the allied nations that are fighting for democracy." This is perhaps the most regrettable editorial sentence he wrote in his entire life, because it symbolized his capitulation to the war, or at least to supporting basically this effort to get out the war. Harrison had a very different response. He worked with William Monroe Trotter, A. Philip Randolph, and a number of other people, to convene the Liberty Congress of Negro Americans. This is the only independent anti-war or dissenting gathering of African Americans during the war, which put a petition to Congress about lynching and disfranchisement and segregation, the lack of democracy which the U.S. was supposedly fighting for in the war. And Harrison cleverly avoided the kind of imprisonment that Eugene Debs and others faced, and also the deportation that some foreign-born radicals like him faced. But he also avoided capitulation in the case of Du Bois. And the way he did it was by using the government's rhetoric against it. He said, "America's in this war to win. The nation will brook no attempt to compromise its declared principles. The world, the whole world, Tennessee, as well as Turkey, must be made safe for democracy, and we must fight on until this end is accomplished." So he's kind of making a pseudo-patriotic argument to uplift the grievances of African Americans, the fact that there was no democracy in the South for African Americans. And of course, lest anybody, there's more we could say about his clash with Du Bois. He ends up exposing the fact that Du Bois attempted to become a captain in U.S. military intelligence during the war, effectively selling out and abandoning his principled stance in favor of expressing African American grievances. We can come back to that in the conversation, because I want to get to some other things here. The Red Summer, in addition to the Red Scare, there was also a Red Summer in 1919, in which, dozens of cities and towns experienced white riots against Black communities and massacres. This produced a massive contributed to a massive awakening, what we might call the New Negro movement, which is part of a global political awakening that includes things like the Russian Revolution, which I mentioned earlier. And just as a brief aside, Harrison, there's a moment where military intelligence gets very concerned in 1919 about a meeting that takes place in Washington, D.C., in which Harrison is addressing, you know, local Black community in Washington, and he says Bolshevism is the salvation of America. We can talk more about why he might have said that if you like. Harrison had a whole analysis of what he called the White War, the White World War, as a product of the capitalist system, as a product of the class struggle between different countries. It's very similar, for those who are familiar with it, to Lenin's imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. Um, since every industrial nation is seeking the same outlets for its products, clashes are inevitable, and in these clashes, beaks and claws, armies and navies must come into play. This idea that, the concentration and centralization of capital eventually leads it to seek outlets in other parts of the globe, and this puts any capitalist country into competition with others at an international level. We saw this in Asia with the competition over colonies by Europeans in Asia, in Africa, of course. The whole experience of colonialism is one of the major contributing factors to World War One. And as Harrison puts it, the exploitation of white men in Europe and America becomes the reason for the exploitation of black and brown and yellow men in Africa and Asia. As long as black men are exploited by white men in Africa, so long must white men cut each other's throats over that exploitation. We could talk about U.S. imperialism in Latin America in this period, which is extensive. I mean, the Wilson administration is invading countries left and right, sending the troops into Haiti, sending troops into Dominican Republic, taking over the Virgin Islands, Harrison's native island of St. Croix included. Another thing we could talk more about if people are curious in the discussion is the Garvey movement. I mean, this is a massive Black internationalist or Black nationalist movement that really sweeps across the African world, developing branches, not just in the US where it was based, but in the Caribbean, in Central and South America, even Western and Southern Africa, and in the UK. The largest transnational organization of Black people in modern history up to that point. Very influential on a whole generation of African nationalists, the red, black, and green flag, which remains a symbol to this day. All of this stuff came out of Harrison's Liberty League, right? Because Marcus Garvey joins Harrison's Liberty League when he gets to Harlem, and he learns a whole bunch of strategic and political ideas, including the race first idea, the African consciousness, the mass movement rather than industrial school, which he was initially trying to build. The internationalist perspective comes out of Harrison's internationalism, the tricolor flag. The Liberty League had a tricolor flag before the Garvey movement. And Harrison ends up joining the Garvey movement after influencing Garvey's rise. Harrison becomes editor of the Negro World, and one of the most powerful things he does in that role is to issue this call for what he calls a colored international. He says a call should be issued for a Congress of the darker races, which should be frankly anti-imperialistic. Sorry, that's supposed to say anti, and should serve as an international center of cooperation from which strength may be drawn for the several sections of the world of color. The Congress should be made up of those who realize that capitalist imperialism, which mercilessly exploits the darker races for its own financial purposes, is the enemy which we must combine to fight. So this idea of an alliance of all the colonized peoples of the world linking up to smash capitalist imperialism is what he had in mind. The only example, at least for the early 1920s, the only example, or one of the few examples of an internationalism that is both race conscious and class conscious and anti-imperialist. We can talk more about that in conversation. The last piece I'll share about Harrison, or the last dimension of his politics that I'll talk about, which I touch on in chapter 6 of my book, is Harrison's, what I call his Black free love politics. And so one of the things that is fascinating about Harrison is he, in addition to being a free thinker and a socialist and an internationalist, he's also a free lover. And this this document was just one of those ones I found in the archive, which opened up a whole new world of interesting questions for me. This is a series of lectures Harrison gives in 1917 on sex, including subjects like marriage versus free love. Is birth control hurtful or helpful? Harrison is, as far as I can tell, one of the first African American voices in history to openly talk about and defend birth control and call for decriminalizing access to contraception. He talks about whether we are monogamists by nature. He had a whole analysis of the origin of our sex ideals being rooted in class society from feudalism to capitalism, and in a puritanical sex negative morality from the Christian church. And then, of course, the Society for the Suppression of Vice. This was one of the anti-vice organizations headed by Anthony Comstock, which is part of a larger system of repression of sexuality that's going on in the early 20th century from the church, as well as from the federal government. People who know about the Comstock laws that criminalized basically everything to do with sex, including, paintings and works of art and novels that were seen to be too sexual. And then, of course, there's lynching, right? Black men are being lynched roughly twice a week, supposedly for their hypersexuality or their threat, quote unquote, threat to the purity of white women. And so for Harrison to come out as a Black free lover in this context of church repression and state repression and racist racial oppression of Black sexuality is really quite extraordinary. And so, yeah, we could talk about the blues women. There's a larger sexual awakening that's happening in Harlem at this time during the Harlem Renaissance. Um, but let me just close because I don't want to take up too much more time. Let me just close by a note about how and why Harrison has been so thoroughly erased, not just from scholarly history, but also popular memory. Um, Now, there's a couple of superficial reasons that you could look at. He was averse to praise. He didn't covet the limelight. He lacked formal college degrees. He was largely self-taught, had a genius level intellect, but largely self-taught. And he died, relatively young at 44 and under suspicious circumstances, which we can talk about if people are interested. But I think the bigger reason for Harrison's historical erasure is the politics of history, right? The idea that too often history represents the interests of the powerful. Tales of the hunt often glorify the hunter. Those who control the present often control what we understand about the past, or which narratives become dominant about the past. And of course, Harrison's example kind of is like a touchstone in some ways that reveals the impurity of the metals that touch it. We could talk about the racism that he encountered in the Socialist Party. We could talk about the capitalist imperialism that he encountered in the Garvey movement, kind of black capitalist or black imperialist formation ultimately that he decides to leave. And then, of course, we could also talk about the so-called Harlem Renaissance and how this framework essentially emphasizes arts and culture over the race radical and class radical new Negro elements that emerge in the 1910s and 20s, because the white publishing industry wanted to handpick certain Black artists and promote them, as part of their marketing strategy. So, yeah, that's the sort of summary or brief overview of the book. I know that I covered a lot of ground, and I'm happy to talk more to people about what it's about. But I really poured my heart and soul into this book. I mean, it has, over a decade of work, researching, writing, reflecting, revising. But don't take my word for it. Robin D.G. Kelly, I'm grateful, has offered this review. He said Brian Kwoba has written a beautiful intellectual biography as radical and original as its subject. This really means a lot to me because coming from somebody like Robin, author of Hammer and Hoe, which was mentioned earlier, among many other books. Robin is saying something very, very powerful here, and yeah, so I'll leave it there. Happy to talk more about anything and everything that people want to dig into. Thank you.
Wow, what a terrific subject, but also a really great talk covering so much ground in such a short period of time. We could probably talk all week to go through everything that you mentioned. And while this image is up, everybody should note the discount on the book if you get it directly from University of North Carolina, which when I first saw that, I was going to thank you, but then I saw that right now they're having a promotion on all their contemporary history series. So it was still nice to see that they included this book as part of this overall vision of what people should be reading. Very wide ranging. So we're going to open it up for discussion. And just to start it off, I was going to bring up one point. And this is a quote from the introduction. So I'm not going to read what this follows, but you write, said differently, Harrison offers a unique point of departure for a kind of, quote, unified field theory of radical politics that reveals revolutionary possibilities inherent in the integration of liberatory traditions that are too often compartmentalized from one another. Engaging the many dimensions of Harrison's politics, therefore, presents a singularity through which multiple streams of radical thought can illuminate and expand each other as the interconnected pieces of a larger puzzle. And then a bit later, you say, you make this, in one paragraph, you make this interesting comparison between Einstein as like emblematic genius, which you say is coded white and male. And then you say, but the genius, which shares a root with generative force of blackness, is always a collectivity, Ubuntu and Umoja, far from the only underappreciated mind in Harlem. Harrison, naturally worked out his ideas in collaboration and contestation with the larger communities to which he belonged. And those comments kind of crystallized to me this puzzle about his ability to influence, to draw in so many sources and influence so many people, and then you sort of disappear from at least conventional and even left wisdom until you and Jeff Perry and a couple others bring it back. And I wonder if you could comment more on this idea that his strength, both in drawing in many different threads and then influencing many different people, also, is it on balance a strength that what kind of strength is it if his unique perspective has sort of, as you say, been erased? I'm sure you struggled with that a lot. And I would also notice, I read a number of articles that you wrote that you have on your personal website, as well as the introduction. And it's interesting that in different ones of the articles, you give different emphasis to what the source of his erasure was. And I think that relates to this too. So
Yeah.
if you could comment on that, and then that'll give everybody a chance to, put stack in the chat or raise your hand or just let us know you'd like to ask Brian a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for that, Steve, and thanks for sharing the quote from the book as well. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I had to do was continuously think about why and how he got so thoroughly marginalized, not just in the popular memory and what many people know or don't know about Harrison, but even in the scholarly historiography. I was just constantly confronted with this question of historical erasure. And so at this point, one of the more recent realizations I've had about that is precisely that Harrison is a rare bird because he is so multidimensional and multifaceted. It makes it hard to pigeonhole him or put him in just one category. And then you combine that with the fact that most of the categories he belongs in um, have had difficulty engaging with him because he presents a critique from within. So, for example, the Socialist Party, Harrison is critiquing the racial limitations, right? The white racism of the party in particular ways that end up making it impossible for him to stay. And so he leaves the party, and the historians of the Socialist Party often failed to acknowledge his presence at all, because it's a little embarrassing or difficult to engage with such a forceful critic, who was right about the limitations of the Socialist Party. I mean, they had special outreach and associations for Poles and Latvians and, Russians and all these different ethnic groups. When it came to black folks, they didn't seem, they initially tried to do that and then quickly kind of abandoned it when it became a threat. Same with the Garvey movement, right? Harrison plays a decisive role in catalyzing the rise of Garvey and Garveyism, but he also becomes a very staunch and internal critic that is difficult for Garvey partisans to engage with. So they wrote him out of their history too. Same with the Harlem Renaissance, right? Harrison says that the matter of a Negro literary renaissance in Harlem is like the snakes of Ireland. There isn't any. His argument wasn't that it wasn't that there was no such thing as arts and culture in Harlem. His argument was that from the 19th century, from the mid 19th century, all the way up to the 1910s and 20s, there was a number of black literary and artistic figures, William Wells Brown, so many, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, Pauline Hopkins. I could go on, who were being ignored by this Renaissance craze. And so the historians of the Harlem Renaissance and the architects of that narrative framework wrote Harrison out of their story, even though it would be difficult to find more of a Renaissance man than Harrison in Harlem. So all these different historiographies have written Harrison out of their history, even if he played a decisive role in their formation, because he's a difficult and forceful internal critic of them. And that's something that I think makes it all the more interesting to study Harrison, because he's got a unique vantage point on all of them, right? On the race radical Garvey movement and the class radical Garvey movement and the, free love and free thinking and the movement, for sexual liberation, right? He's got all these things kind of in a prism. I talk about his prismatic crystallography towards the end of the book because he's crystallizing ideas, he's bringing things together, and often seeding what become larger structures. Just like the Liberty League essentially was the seed form for the Garvey movement that becomes this massive international, organization. Um, and that's, I think, his strength, right? His strength is his ability to crystallize and synthesize these things in ways that then other people are able to kind of grow or take up, or not, depending on the situation. But yeah, I think that helps explain why he was erased, is that many of the places that should have remembered him or kept his memory alive, um, they were a little embarrassed by his critique, and so that made them less likely to, if that makes sense.
Very helpful. Before I pass it on, just to follow up, the last thing that I read, though, as I read that, I mean, earlier, I kept wondering about your comment that, blackness is always a collectivity. So his ability to touch so many things, bring them in, and then influence people back out. Maybe even though other people eclipsed him over time, were you trying to say that his way of doing things epitomized this idea of collectivity, in developing, advanced political thought.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah,
This
definitely.
eternal contradiction.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I mean, part of the approach that I take here, as you will have seen, in the introduction is to make clear that I'm not here to propound a great man theory of history, according to which, history is always made by exceptional individual males. Um, as I try to show in the book, there's a lot more to the story. There's social movements, there's class struggle, there's, all these different political contextations around race and gender and nation. Um, and Harrison is both learning from and taking in and synthesizing a lot of the radical traditions and the lessons that they have to hold, in which he's connected to, whether it's free thinking, whether it's the socialists, whether it's Black internationalists. But then he's able to synthesize them and crystallize things that then others can kind of latch onto as well. And that's a very, I think, kind of unique position for him, and something that I think was hard to articulate until until I was like sitting with it all these different sides of him, and trying to express like what is it that he's doing. And there was actually a one of his proteges, Hodge Kernan, who hit on that phrase, Harrison as a crystallizer. He said Harrison's Voice newspaper crystallized the radicalism of New York, in a particular way.
So Carl, then Fred, and then Joe. And I should say that Carl and Fred, along with Rebecca, are my three uh, buddies in facilitating this enterprise. So, Carl.
I'm just going to make some comments and see what your reaction is to them. I didn't know that much about him until like I said, I was working with Haywood, and he had a chapter in his book on the Garvey movement, and he complained to me that every time he tried to write about Garvey, he he got intense opposition from his party leadership, and they were always pressing him to, you know, put Garvey in a niche somewhere and dismiss him. But Harry understood. He kept telling me, and I'm sure he told others too. He said, "Look, the Garvey movement was an elemental rising. It shows that the national character of the African American people, their national consciousness, is not something concocted by a couple of resolutions in the Comintern. It grew out of uh, the history of North America, and it was a natural expression of it." He said there was much to criticize about Garvey, but to denounce his whole movement meant that you would never get right the relationship between a multinational working class and the nationalist movements that were arising, like, Black nationalism, Chicano nationalism, Puerto Rican, whatever. You would never get it right. The idea was that, the trade union movement and the working class, supposedly united, has to lead. And these are, important but secondary allies who have to trail behind, or at best alongside this working class and communist working class, and basically take its leadership from them. That was not going to happen with people like Harrison and many, many other people too. And Harry had a sense of that, and he said he kept trying to tell people, you're you don't get it about the Garvey movement. I mean, it's long reaching here today in Pittsburgh. There's the main black leftist in Pittsburgh is Carl Redwood, and he's got a lot of followers and a deep following in the city. But his whole family came out are Garveyists. and come out of the Garvey movement, his mother and his grandmother and so on. And it's him too. So his radicalism is socialism is tinged with an aspect of Black nationalism, including the taste of Garvey. It's still here. It's still part of us. I mean, us, meaning what should be us anyway, the revolutionary left. We should, yeah, Hubert Harrison is one of our guys. And thank God to Jeff Perry for bringing him back from intentional dismissal on people who wanted a different version of history than the one that was most important and real.
Well, that's a great note to add. I think maybe Fred and then Joe make your comments and questions, then we'll let Brian respond to all three and then do another round. Fred, I think you're muted.
Yeah, no, I'm not muted now. Yeah, one thing I'm curious about is Harrison's relationship to the early Communist Party in the United States, which was formed in, 1919 or so, out of a faction of the Socialist Party and other groups. So Harrison clearly did not join the Communist Party, and it's not clear so far from what I've read in the book what relationship, if any, he did have to it. One reason I asked that question is because the interesting convergence between Harrison's call for a colored international on the one hand and the actual convening of the Congress of the Peoples of the East by the Communist International around that same time. So just to kind of to fill out the story and say some words about Harrison's actual relationship, if any, with the early communist movement in the U.S.
I'm going to let Emily jump the line just so it's not all guys one after the other, and then Joe, and then back to you, Brian.
Thank you, Steve. I want to know the gossip. I would like to know something about his intimate relationships, and I'm very curious about the suspicious nature of his death way too young.
Yeah, me too. Joe.
Yeah, I thank you so much for doing this work and making a lot of the work that Jeff Perry did, which was wonderful. I mean, he was a friend of mine too, but inaccessible to a general reader. He wrote an major academic treatise, and but this is accessible and it's wonderful, and I hope it gets wide circulation, despite being a university press book. I will do what I can to spread it around. My question, sort of leading off of Emily a little bit, is, I mean, I don't believe in the great man theory of history either, but it is interesting and useful sometimes to know something about the personal background of people. What do you think was the combination of early influences and continuing influences that made it possible for him to take some courageous, I mean, almost uniquely courageous positions? I mean, in the midst of racial, sexual lynching nationwide, for him to come out in favor of a black man in his prime of life calling for free love. My God. I mean, that's almost worse than being a socialist, and many people's minds would have been the same, of course, but I mean, and coming out, organizing, people to be opposed to the war after the NAA and Du Bois, supported it. We should all say, of course, that Du Bois, apologized for that terrible mistake later on. I don't know if everybody on this call knows that, but that shouldn't be left hanging like that. That he also saw it as one of the great errors of his life. Uh, uh, even long before he became a communist and an open Marxist. So anyway, if you want to talk a little bit about what you think gave Harrison the power and the self-confidence and the ideas themselves, but also the courage to take some of these positions. I mean, I remember reading Jeff's book, but hearing this again, I'm just blown away by that, and
Yeah,
sort of builds on what Emily was saying.
well put, Joe. Ryan, thoughts?
Yeah, well, thanks for this is some great questions. So thanks to everyone who's shared them all. I'll try my best to address them. But of course, the book is going to be the better place to get the full detail that I can't provide in a short time. Um, yeah, the Garvey movement is absolutely critical. Just to give one simple example of that. It's worth remembering that both of Malcolm X's parents, his father Earl and his mother Louise Little, were active Garvey members of the UNIA, active in the Garvey movement. And that's just one of many examples I could give. Kwame Nkrumah, the first prime minister of Ghana, put a black star in the middle of the flag of Ghana and as an homage to the Black Star Line of Marcus Garvey. Um, but of course, Garvey ran into some very serious and fateful antagonisms with, black communists, particularly in the 20s and after that. Um, and I think, a part of what's interesting about Harrison is, as Perry put it, he called Harrison the most race radical of the class radicals and the most class radical of the race radicals. In other words, he was the most race conscious in the Socialist Party, but they couldn't really handle that. So he found the Liberty League, which leads to the Garvey movement and this race radical movement. But then he's class conscious within the Garvey movement. So one of the things he does to work with black communists is in 1921 when he convenes a meeting of the so-called Black Reds, people like Claude McKay, Grace Campbell, Cyril Briggs, Wilfred Domingo, the first generation of black communists. And the purpose of the meeting, as McKay would explain in his autobiography, was to see if they could make the Garvey movement more class conscious,
Oh,
which is a fascinating project. It's one of the many things Harrison did within the Garvey movement, try to push it in a different direction. He also tried to make the Garvey movement more anti-imperialist, asking for example, were they going to do about the U.S. occupation of Haiti? Um, and he tried to push the Garvey movement in a party building direction. He founded the Liberty Party, which was only the second example in history of an all-black political party, to try to give political expression to this new Negro movement that was on the rise. But I think what's great about what y'all are doing is the wisdom and insights of studying the black working class, right? Because far from being allies, far from thinking of black communities as allies to a working class struggle, Harrison maintained, for example, that the black population was the most thoroughly proletarian population in the country, precisely because most people of African descent who are here were brought, their ancestors were brought as enslaved people to do work, to labor, to create the workforce. It's something that Du Bois emphasizes in Black Reconstruction by starting his first chapter with the black worker. He's placing the black worker at the center of the analysis, both in theory and in the practice in terms of how he analyzes the Civil War. Um, and this is the great tragedy, right? That black radicals in socialist formations and in the Communist Party to some degree felt like they had to fight an uphill battle just for recognition. Meanwhile, you know, they're at the center of the story. If you're talking about proletarian emancipation, but you're excluding or you're, marginalizing the most thoroughly proletarian population in the country, it throws off all your all your sort of metrics and calibrations, for reasons that I think are pretty clear. Um, And this is again what's fascinating about Harrison's internationalism, right? He's this theory of the colored international is in many ways a complement to the Communist International. The Communist International was a federation or sort of grouping of all the communist parties, but most of them were European, and most of the positions they took were about events in Europe, understandably, because that was their field of action. The colonized world did not have much representation apart from what was mentioned, the Congress of the Peoples of the East. But in some ways, that was an appendage to the larger Comintern because there were peoples of the East right in the Russian Empire itself, not to mention surrounding it. But when you look at Africa or Asia or Latin America, well, Asia was represented, but Africa and Latin America and the Caribbean were not so represented in the Communist International. And so the way I think of them, and Harrison said, we're willing to work with, the Colored International should be willing to work with white radicals, right, and Europeans who want to smash capitalism and imperialism as well. But we're not going to we're not going to be subordinate to them, was his point, right? There's a moment where Rose Pastor Stokes of the Communist Party approaches Harrison and tries to get him to basically become a sort of Communist Party member within the Garvey movement. And Harrison kind of keeps them at an arm's length because, the negative experience he had in the Socialist Party trying to get white radicals to take the black working class more seriously, I think made him, as I say in the book, once bitten, twice shy towards the white left. And so when the communists want to recruit him, he's twice shy because he's skeptical of their aims and sort of the way in which he who pays the piper calls the tune. And so if he accepted funding from the Communist Party, he felt like it would tie his tongue in particular ways that he didn't want. As for the gossip, so there's a lot of juicy gossip, about his love life. I mean, he was a free lover. It has to be said he also was married with children, and his free love, his free love tendencies are ultimately what makes that marriage, or at least cohabiting, untenable. So he and his wife Lynn stopped cohabiting at some point when it basically becomes untenable for them to do so. He's still co-parenting their children and they end up having a fifth child 6 years after they stopped cohabiting. So it's clear that Harrison never stopped loving his wife Lynn, but he also didn't stop, cultivating erotic energy exchanges and relationships with some very high profile people. Augusta Savage, the famous sculptress, is one example. Amy Ashwood Garvey, Garvey's first wife, who then, they separate. She ends up, working with Harrison on a book. Harrison is ghostwriting her book called The Rise and Fall of Marcus Garvey. And they're also having a passionate love affair. Yeah, we could we could talk more about that, but it's in the book. I mentioned it in chapter 6 in the book. The circumstances of his death were suspicious. I mean, he went in. He had appendicitis, and he went in to get an operation to remove his appendix. But the way that Perry writes that account, it sort of raised some questions for me because he goes in, he has the operation on a Thursday. He seems to be improving, and in fact, he improves so much in recovery that the next day, Friday, there's visitors coming to greet him in the hospital, and he seems to be in good spirits. And then suddenly, Friday night, things take a turn for the worse, and he ends up dying. And it's not clear what changed from Friday day to Friday at night. The question is raised, like, was he poisoned? Was there foul play involved in his death? Surely if his appendix had burst before the surgery, then the surgeon would have seen that and it would have been obvious. And, so anyway, there's a number of questions there. I don't have anything definitive, but it is a mysterious kind of circumstance of his death. Lastly, this question of his power or his confidence and his courage to take some of these positions. I think part of where that comes from is his genius level intellect, which many Harlemites commented on. He spoke many languages. He read multiple books a day. He had encyclopedic knowledge that he would share on those street corners as a stepladder orator. combined with his addiction to learning. I mean, he read everything he could about multiple different subjects, right? He studied anthropology and psychology and sociology and African history and sexology and literature. I mean, he used to give lectures on the what we think of as the canonical English literature, Mark Twain and all just all kinds of different things. And so I think that knowledge base gave him courage because he understood very deeply the sort of historical materialist history of sexual morality, which he located in capitalism and the church and puritanical Christianity, right? He understood very deeply the rich history of African civilizations, African scientific achievements, which gave him, a sort of pride, a racial pride that people who didn't do those kind of studies wouldn't have had. Of course, he studied, the history of Marxism, of the labor movements, of developments in the world, in the Islamic world, in Europe, in Africa, in India, and so he had a worldly knowledge that I think gave him more courage to take positions because he knew certain things or he could see certain things that people with less information or less sort of rigorous study could see, if that makes sense. And so, yeah, I'm glad to hear that y'all are finding this volume accessible because, one of the things about Perry's work is it is a little bit overwhelming, right? He's written this extraordinary 2-volume biography, but at over 1,200 pages, not including footnotes. I think that is a little bit prohibitive for some readers, or at least for the general reader. And so it's great for me as I used Perry's work as a reference work because it's so detailed and so meticulous. It was a great foundation for me. But I'm really trying to make Harrison accessible to the people. So that's why it's a 1-volume interpretation, and it's thematic, right? It's not a strict chronological biography because Perry's already done that. And I think what was needed or what is needed is more of an analytical interpretation of why is Harrison significant? What happens when we put Harrison back into this history or histories that he's been excluded from for so long?
Hmm. So Emily, I see Emily has the paperback version and the bookmark is well into it. That's great. So Emily asked
I checked it
about,
out in the library. Somebody else put that book.
oh, okay. So on the personal level, but going in a different direction, it's interesting that Harrison was kind of an open book, and you know, his personal views, his cultural views were as important, and his presence was as important to him as his, political views. And I noticed in the book at the beginning of each chapter, instead of like a quote from somebody else, you have these little smidgens of like blank verse that appears like you wrote. And then I came across your blank verse autobiographical note, which is very personal. And it made me wonder if you felt like it, like, what are you working on right now? And, who do you see as the audience for this book? And where are you going to sprinkle your wisdom next? And so on, like where does this book fit into Brian Kwoba journey? If you don't mind going in that direction.
Yeah, sure. No, that's a great question. Yeah, I mean, I did something that is not necessarily standard practice, for a book from a scholar, which is that in the preface, I tell a lot of my personal story and the activism that I've been involved with over the years. And part of the reason I do that is not just to show or explain how I approach Harrison, for example, having been to countless marches and protests and rallies and organizing meetings as an activist, just like Hubert Harrison had. But it's also to try to communicate who I think the audience for this book is, which is not just scholars or people in the academy, but activists and organizers and people on the ground who are doing that kind of work, right? I tried to write this book almost as like a handbook for activists. I mean, of course, it is a work of history and it's, telling stories from the early 20th century, but it's done so with an eye towards, drawing out the lessons and relevance of that history for the present day, right? A lot of people, for example, never heard of the Seattle General Strike. That's a powerful piece of history because, first of all, there have been general strikes in the United States. And second of all, those are the kind of histories that were deliberately not taught in our K through 12 schools because they're so empowering, because they're so subversive of the status quo, right? Not to mention the Russian Revolution. I mean, I engage with the Russian Revolution continuously throughout this book. Number one, because I had, a lot of deep study in that subject when I was in the ISO. But number two, because it's a massive world event that Harrison is witnessing himself unfolding in real time, right? The Liberty League is founded in 1917, the very year that, first the Tsar is overthrown. And then there's, the Bolshevik-led revolution in October. Um, so I see the audience for this book being all kinds of people, people, not just scholars, but like people who just want to learn, history, who want to be empowered in their activism, who want to understand better the connections between, some of the different radicalisms that are all combined in a single frame in Harrison's sort of legacy. Because I think that's very instructive. I think we need to break down some of the compartmentalization that exists where you have Marxists and class radicals over here who don't talk to the race radicals and the black nationalists over here, who are not talking to the free lovers over here, who are not talking to, you know, um, maybe the free thinkers and anti-religious or religion critical people over there. You know what I mean? Like all these things can learn from each other. All these things have ways they can illuminate each other, and I think that's one of the sort of benefits of studying a figure like Harrison is that it forces you to really reckon with and grapple with more than just a one-dimensional framework.
Wow. So I was going to say, I mean, we have to talk among ourselves, but I was thinking if we do take up this book to read it, given what you were just saying about the audience, I hope we could stay in touch. And, if we develop a study guide, I know you teach at the university level, but if we develop something that's more appropriate for us, we're not quite an outdoor university, we're little. But for other groups, maybe that would be a small contribution back we can make you publishing this book. And also, as I'm sure Fred said, bringing you in right now here to speak with us tonight was what we could do in a week, but we would love to invite you back in the fall and to publicize it to our whole mailing list and have a bigger event if you are up for it.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I would love to do that because I think the conversation will only get richer and more fruitful as more people have actually engaged with the work and read at least some of the chapters, if not the whole book. So yeah, I would be happy to come back, in a future meeting or a future session that y'all want to do. Because the thing about it is that Harrison, for the World War One era, Harrison really symbolizes a particular socialist tradition, a black radical tradition and socialist tradition, um, more than almost any other figure, more than a Du Bois, who, much like the parties of the Second International, capitulated during World War One. More than a Garvey, who, was not class conscious and actually thought capitalism was a necessary thing. Somebody like A. Philip Randolph is a direct sort of descendant or protege of Harrison. As he himself said, Randolph called Harrison the father of Harlem radicalism.
Wow.
And so yeah, he's in our tradition in that sense, and he's one of our political ancestors that has just been forgotten for too long, marginalized for too long. And I think when you start to see what he was about, you realize why. You realize he was radical in ways that are difficult to kind of harmonize with the sort of canonical pillars of radical thought as they've been traditionally defined. So yeah.
Wonderful. Um, Time for one last question. I thought I saw Victor. Did you your hand up? Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I wasn't sure whether we were running out of time, but just in terms of the free love, did he ever deal at all with the issue of, well, I mean, I don't think transsexual would be in that era an issue, but homosexuality, the oppression of, because obviously that's a front and center issue for us today. And I just wonder if he dealt with that subject at all. And I'm really happy about your popularization. I know that's so important. I think it was MEP, if I'm not mistaken, that had a webinar on Engels as a popularizer and how critical popular education is. So I'm really glad, and thank you for the book. I'm looking for. I haven't got it yet, but I definitely will get it. And so, anyways, those are the kind of questions that I had. Just
Yeah, I mean, I actually have a whole chapter, chapter 6, which is called Black Free Love Politics and the Queer New Negro. Um, and it goes into not just Harrison's a kind of reconstruction of Harrison's thinking about free love and sexuality and these questions, but also the context of the times. I mentioned the so-called Harlem Renaissance and the sort of sexual fluidity and experimentation that went along with the artistic and cultural fluidity and experimentation of that era. And I think you'll find that I think you'll find that chapter to be really groundbreaking in some ways because this is a an area where some of the places where we might traditionally assume that there's been more criticism of the sexual order, we don't find it. And I'm talking here specifically about Harrison's argument that we're not monogamists by nature. Um, in queer theory, you don't find a lot of critique or systemic interrogation of compulsory monogamy. Much as even though you find a lot of interrogation and critique of compulsory heterosexuality, right, or heteronormativity, um, you don't find the other one. And so I think it's a contribution to queer studies, queer theory, and particularly the non-mainstream Black sexualities tradition that people like Claude McKay, for example, Langston Hughes, the blues women who I mentioned, who are expressing all kinds of, sexually liberated themes, not just same gender sexual attraction or, erotic energy exchange, but non-monogamous attraction and erotic energy exchange. It almost feels like a new frontier, like a whole new field of exploration to do the work that Harrison was doing, or recover that work of connecting capitalism and colonialism and white supremacy and puritanical Christianity to compulsory monogamy, right? To see that as part and parcel of the same package of systems, it really opens a lot of new interesting questions. And so I think you'll find that chapter 6 alone is worth the price of this book. But also, let me just say, this piece has a lot of my blood, sweat, and tears, my heart and soul in it. So you're not just buying a book, you're buying like a piece of my heart and soul. So I think you'll enjoy that chapter especially. But a lot of the chapter, I mean, that's only one of 9 chapters. So there's a lot in the book. There's a lot of information, ideas, histories, unknown histories. And so, yeah, I think you'll appreciate that chapter in particular on this question.
I think I can say for everybody that this was a real treat, a real condensed education, and I do feel like I feel good about the connection that I believe we've made and hope we can continue. So.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you. Thank all of you for your interest and support for the work. Thanks for inviting me to be a part of this session. And yeah, look forward to further engagements.